Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing. Ms. Jackson Lee is on her way. Mr. Conyers is with us. We have a nice group on our side, and I know Chairman Goodlatte, this means a lot to him as well. So we will we'll work the openings in as people come, and I will recognize myself for my opening. I want to thank you again for being here today. This is our second hearing in a series to examine the Justice Department and its component agencies to identify areas where we can make our justice system both fully respected and fully worthy of respect. So I want to thank both of you, not just for being here today, but also for your long, distinguished careers in public service, which we will go into in more detail when you're introduced. As we all know, the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives plays a critical role in protecting the safety and security of our communities. If you'll allow me just a brief moment of personal indulgence, as former prosecutors like to do from time to time, we like to reminisce on the last good job we had, which was being a prosecutor. And I can tell you too that what you remember are the victims and their courage and heroism. And you remember the men and women of law enforcement and their integrity. You forget about the bad rulings. You forget about the jury verdicts that didn't go your way. You even, after time, forget about the defense attorneys. But you don't ever forget the women and men that you work with in law enforcement and especially the victims. So, Mr. Rosenberg, when I see DEA, of course, I think of the nation's premier narcotics investigation entity, but I really think about the DEA agents whose name may never be known and never be called in a public hearing, but do the work. I won't call the names of the folks in South Carolina because I'm going to leave one of them out, but I would be very grateful if you could let the women and men who are still in DEA from yesterday and those that are there now know how grateful each of us across both sides of the aisle are for their work. And Mr. Brandon, the same to you. You and I know some ATF agents. We both know some of the same ones, and they remain some of the fondest memories that I have from that time period of my life. If you would let the folks in South Carolina know how grateful we are for their continued service, and those who once served in South Carolina but have spread out across the country, I'd be grateful to you for that. We have a lot of challenges. In my home state of South Carolina, at least 95 people died from heroin in 2015, which is almost twice as many as the previous year, and more than 500 died from abuse of prescription opioids over that same time period. Roughly half of these deaths attributed to drug overdose in South Carolina involved a synthetic opioid, which is almost 100 times more potent than morphine. And not only are we seeing an increase in deaths due to drug abuse, but we've also seen a recent spike in violent crime nationwide. To be fair, violent crime has been going down for a long time. And once it goes down so low, it only has one place to go. But I do think that we ought to be mindful of the fact that there has been, at least in certain categories as they keep statistics, something of a spike. In 2016, violent crime increased in many of our nation's largest cities, which is the second year that metro areas saw an increase in homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. No agency is perfect. Congress certainly is not perfect, which may represent an understatement of biblical proportions, but it is our duty as an oversight body, as flawed as we are, to ensure that law enforcement agencies learn from mistakes, use taxpayer dollars responsibly and efficiently, remain committed to their core missions of protecting the American people. We have a justice system that is looked to by everyone for fairness, efficiency, thoroughness, professionalism. Public safety is, at least in my judgment, the preeminent function of government, inasmuch as it is a subset of national security. And at the state and local level, public safety may be tied with education as the preeminent function of government. So it's not only incredibly important, it's incredibly important how people perceive the system. It can be fair but not perceived that way, and we still have a problem. So I know that both of you feel that way, or you would not have devoted your lives to the pursuit of justice. Over the course of the next several months, I want to work with both of you, not just in public hearings, but also privately, to make sure that Congress is doing everything it can do to enable you to fulfill your missions, and also to reflect on your missions, to make sure that we are pursuing the toughest where necessary and the smartest at all times policies we can, whether it is drug overdoses, narcotics trafficking, violent crimes, firearms trafficking, any other issue that impacts public safety and the well-being of our fellow citizens. I know that both of you, each of you, and each member of this committee wants not just the best, but the most respected justice system we can possibly have. And part of that is having frank conversations about sentencing laws and declination levels, and 924Es, mental health, how it impacts your ability to do your job, how we as a society are treating mental health related issues. The justice system is, I was eating dinner with Tim Scott last night, who is a senator from South Carolina, and the person I respect most in politics. We have to have a justice system that people respect. And we have to be willing to ask tough questions, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that everyone doesn't perceive the justice system in precisely the same way. But it is the most unifying and equalizing force that we have in our culture. The fact that it is represented by a blindfolded woman tells us all we need to know. So you have the highest of all callings. And I'll say this in conclusion: next month, Congress recognizes National Police Week. That's in May. This is April. I'm not going to wait till May. I want to say, as a husband and a father and a citizen, how much I appreciate the line of work that y'all have chosen to go into, and make sure the women and men that work in your agencies know how grateful we are. That won't stop us from doing oversight, but it'll make us cognizant of the challenges that some people have volunteered for to keep other people safe. And with that, I would recognize the ranking member from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to my colleagues and members, and good morning to the witnesses. Forgive me for my slight delay. I was just in a meeting dealing with the famine in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I think you may have heard of that disastrous occurrence, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence as we were trying to deliberate on very disastrous outcome to those individuals that are starving. But I join my chairman in acknowledging both Mr. Rosenberg and Mr. Brandon, and appreciate very much the service that the ATF and the DEA gives. One of my greatest pleasures, serving for a good number of years on the Judiciary Committee, was the many men and women in law enforcement on the federal level that I've had to encounter, sometimes in tragic circumstances. I go back on this committee, Mr. Conyers, which I cannot compete with him and his tenure, but we go back to the Waco incident. We go back to the issues with DEA, with just the enormous drug trafficking cartels when cities seemed to be collapsing. And it was the collaboration with local authorities that our federal officers provided such a great, if I might say, friendship, but also being part of solving problems. With respect to the DEA, I think our massive omnibus opioid bill hopefully will, at least on the treatment side, on the intervention side, really be a big boost to your work, because we always hear our neighbors, such as Mexico, suggesting that we are the problem. I don't yield to that, but I do know that we need to get those who are sick and addicted so that you can purge these evil people who violently will perpetrate the business of drugs on innocent communities all over the country. And your work certainly includes a large part of that. with respect to ATF, and I must take a moment to indicate that I flew up yesterday in the backdrop of the killing of Constable Chief Greenwood, and I offered my sympathy to him on the floor yesterday. And again, I offer it today, and this is a gentleman that had been a district attorney and decided that he loved the law so much that as he retired from the district attorney's office, he would go into being a constable. And I don't know if we're familiar with that in other jurisdictions, but constables are like sheriffs over certain jurisdictions, and he was in that capacity, was a chief deputy constable, and there's a long story about all of his work, and he was getting out of his car and it was execution style. So we know that it was purposeful, and it was the illegal use of guns. And I hope that we will be able to discuss these issues. I am a member of the Congressional Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and Policing Strategies Working Group that my chairman and chairman of the full committee and ranking member of the full committee are also members of. And we're looking at a number of issues, but I think it is important to emphasize the crucial work of the DEA and ATF. In particular, every day in America, on average, 93 people die from gun violence, including 7 children and teens. That amounts to more than 33,000 people dying from gun violence in this country every year. And so I am interested in hearing how we are able to enforce laws and to certainly try to work collaboratively on the importance of weeding out, if you will, those who would use guns illegally, those who would traffic guns, which contribute to the dangers of drugs even more, because those who are in heavy drug trafficking, major drug trafficking, certainly are using weapons of choice, which are guns. I've introduced H.R. 62, the Gun Violence Reduction Resources Act, which authorizes the hiring of additional 200 ATF agents and investigators for enforcement of existing gun laws. I certainly don't want to see a budget that diminishes the resources, and I think all of us at this table have indicated that we believe in law enforcement that is just, and that means that we adhere to the principles of no racial profiling. We adhere to the principles of ensuring that the case that we make against individuals is a just case on the facts, and I believe that in many instances, in most instances, our federal officers abide by that. So we need them to be able to protect the people that are really the victims, either of the surge of drugs, large cartels, large shipments, as well as individuals who are taking up guns just to be violent. We passed, as many of you know, in 2010, we lowered the crack powder sentencing disparity from 101 to 18 to 1. Many local jurisdictions around the nation are assessing penalties on drug use, on individual drug use and individual possession in a way that does not incarcerate. So it's a combination of thinking that is on this committee, and we need your insight as we try to balance that individual person who's possessing versus some of the large actors and perpetrators that many of you address, whether it is in gun trafficking or whether it is, of course, in major trafficking. Let me finish my point with respect to the DEA, Mr. Chairman, just on a point to indicate that there are new drugs on the market, and I'll be interested in hearing, Mr. Rosenberg, how you're keeping up with those, and how each new nuance of drug, the artificial drugs, play into the federal enforcement and what we can be helpful in. And Mr. Brandon, be a series of questions that I'll ask as well with respect to your work and how we can be helpful in saving lives. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair will now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Virginia.